There is a smell the marsh makes at low tide, mud and salt and something older underneath. I was standing in it, with a folder of documents under my arm, when my mother saw my face for the first time in 11 years. She did not recognize me at first. She was too busy telling the lawyer that people like me, people who make a living digging through dead people's papers, were a waste of money her family could not afford. My name is Bethany. I am 41 years old, and I am a board-certified forensic genealogist. That is a long way of saying that when a family's land is about to be taken, because nobody can prove who the rightful heirs are, I am the person the court believes. For 30 years, my mother told anyone who would listen that my obsession with family history was morbid, embarrassing, and useless. Then she called my firm, not knowing it was mine, and begged us to save the only thing her family had left. The proof that saved it was a single handwritten page, cut from a Bible she threw in a dumpster 11 years ago. She just didn't know I had it. Before I take you into all of it, I want to ask you for one small thing. If stories like this one mean something to you, stories about the people families underestimate, take a second and hit that like button and subscribe, because it genuinely helps this channel keep going. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read those comments at my own kitchen table, usually with coffee, and there is something about knowing a stranger in Ohio or Manila or Aberdeen is sitting with me in this story that I have never gotten over. All right. Let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Perrins Landing, Georgia, a town of about 1,100 people, 40 minutes inland from Savannah and 20 from Statesboro. It was the kind of place where the gas station also sold bait, and the church parking lot doubled as the fairground. Our house was a brick ranch on Delwood Road with a carport that flooded every September, and my father, Curtis, drove a delivery route for a beverage distributor out of Savannah. My mother, Roberta, ran the front office of the County Farm Bureau, and she ran our house the same way she ran that office, with a strong opinion about what was useful and a shorter patience for what was not. My brother Garrett was born when I was 4, and I want to be fair about him from the start, because this story is not really about Garrett. He was a sweet, uncomplicated kid who liked engines and baseball, and he grew into a man who could fix anything with a motor in it, and none of what happened was his idea. But from the time he could walk, the sun in that house rose over Garrett and set over Garrett, and I learned early that my job was to need less light. What I loved, from the time I was small, was the dead. That sounds worse than it is, so let me say it properly. What I loved was the record of the living, the paper trail every human being leaves behind, the marriage licenses and draft cards and census lines and church rolls that prove a person walked through this world. I loved that a name written in ink in 1911 could still be read in 1994 by a girl lying on her stomach on a den floor. My mother called it morbid. She said it the way you'd say a word for something that needed disinfecting. My grandmother, Geneva, did not call it morbid. Geneva Winslow was my mother's mother, and she lived 9 miles from us, in a white frame house with a screened porch. She is the reason I am who I am, so I want you to be able to see her. She was tall and raw-boned with hands like a man's, hands that had put up vegetables and pulled shrimp nets and buried a husband, and she wore her reading glasses on a chain of red beads. She had been born a Fenwick, out on the coast, before she married my grandfather and moved inland. The Fenwicks were the part of the family nobody talked about much, because they were the part with the land and the long memory and the old, complicated blood. The first time she sat me down at her kitchen table with the family Bible, I was 9 years old. I remember it was August, because the attic fan was running and the tomatoes were in, and she cleared the table, wiped it twice, and made me wash my hands before she would let me touch the book. It was enormous, the size of a lectern Bible, bound in cracked black leather with the stitching showing at the spine, and it had been printed in 1874. But the printed part was not the point. The point was the front, the pages between the covers and the book of Genesis, where 4 generations of Fenwicks had written down their family in their own hands. Births on one page, marriages on another, deaths on a third, in inks that went from brown iron gall scratch to ballpoint blue, in handwriting that changed as one recorder died and another took up the duty. Geneva put her finger, that big knuckled finger, on a line near the top and said, "Read me that one." And I sounded it out. Ezekiel Fenwick, born the 12th of March, 1888. She said, "That's my grandfather, and he bought 18 acres on a bluff over Cutter's Creek in 1913 for $240, and Fenwicks have held it ever since." Then she moved my finger down the page, line by line, birth by birth, and she said the thing that I still repeat, all these years later, to every young genealogist I have ever trained. She said, "Paper is how the dead keep their promises. People will lie to your face, sugar, but a record made at the time, by somebody with no reason to lie, that will still be telling the truth when everybody in this room is gone." I was 9, and I was gone. That was it for me. Other girls in Perrin's Landing collected stickers, and I collected dates. Geneva and I worked that Bible and the boxes that went with it, shoe boxes and hat boxes and one old ammunition crate, all of it full of letters and photographs and land papers and funeral programs. We did it every summer, and most Sunday afternoons, for the next 20 years. She taught me to read old handwriting by tracing it. She taught me that a census taker in 1920 wrote down what he heard, not what was true, so you check everything twice. She taught me to handle a 100-year-old photograph by its edges, the way you'd hold a communion wafer. And there was one page in that Bible she came back to more than any other. It was the second leaf of the births register, water-stained along the bottom edge in a shape like a thumbprint, where a roof leak had gotten to the book sometime in the 1940s. That page carried the line that mattered, the descent from Ezekiel Fenwick down through his 3 children, every birth and every death in order, including 2 entries you could not find anywhere else on Earth. The first was the marriage of Geneva's parents in October of 1929, recorded in her grandmother's slanted hand, because the Bullockside Courthouse Annex that held the license burned in 1936 and took the county's paper with it. The second was a single short line in that same hand. Ollie Fenwick, born June 1919, died August 1921, aged 2 years, our lamb. Geneva would touch that line and go quiet, and once she told me, that baby dying is why the land went the way it went, and one day you'll understand what I mean by that. I did not understand. I was a child. But I memorized the page anyway, the way you memorize a face you love, the brown ink and the blue, the water stain like a thumbprint, The word lamb with its long-tailed bee hold onto that page. This whole story balances on it. Now let me show you what the rest of the house was like, because Geneva's kitchen was 9 miles and one entire world away from my mother's. In my mother's house, worth was a simple equation. Garrett rebuilt a lawnmower engine at 11, and my mother told the story at church for a month. I won the Regional National History Day competition at 12, with a documented family tree going back to 1854. My mother put the certificate in a drawer under the phone book and told me not to bring up dead relatives at Thanksgiving because it made people uncomfortable. When relatives visited, Garrett was called into the living room to be admired. I was asked to refill the tea. I want to be precise here because this channel is not about exaggerating. My mother did not hit me, did not starve me, did not scream. Her weapon was placement. She placed Garrett in the light and me in the hallway, year after year, so smoothly that complaining about it would have sounded insane. You cannot point to a hallway and call it a wound, but you can live in one. There is a wound I can put an exact date on. It came 3 weeks after that History Day win. In the spring, I was 12. It was a Tuesday night, and I had come down the hall in my socks to ask about a permission slip, and the door to my parents' bedroom was cracked about 4 inches with the lamp on. My mother was on the phone with her cousin Faye, the long cord stretched from the nightstand, and I heard my own name, so I stopped. You always stop. And through that cracked door, I heard my mother say, in the light, laughing voice she used for things she had already decided, genealogy isn't a career. It's what you do when you can't handle real life. She'll grow out of it, or she won't amount to anything. Then she laughed at something Faye said back and moved on to talking about the price of propane. I stood in the hallway maybe 30 seconds. Then I walked back to my room, put the permission slip on my desk, and forged her signature for the first and only time in my life. I could not bear to hand her the paper and look at her face. I never told her what I heard. Not that year, not any year. Until the day I am about to tell you about, my mother had no idea those 2 sentences existed anywhere outside her own mouth. But I could have recited them in my sleep, word for word. For 29 years. Children do the math you give them. The math I was given said, the thing you love disqualifies you. So I did what hallway kids do. I got quieter and better. Straight A's, scholarship to Georgia Southern in Statesboro, a history degree with a concentration in archival methods, and every mile of it narrated by my mother as a warning. At my high school graduation dinner, in front of both grandmothers, she raised her sweet tea and said to Bethany, who is going to be the most educated cashier in Bullock County. People laughed. You are supposed to laugh. Geneva did not laugh. She caught my eye across the table and held it, steady as a level, and later that night on her porch she said, "You let me worry about what you'll amount to." Garrett, meanwhile, skipped college, apprenticed at a small engine shop, and by 26 owned it, Thornton Outdoor Power on Highway 24, oil changes and mower blades and a marquee sign out front. And listen, that is honest work and he did it honestly, and I have never once looked down on it. But in my mother's telling, Garrett had built an empire and I was chasing ghosts. When I finished my degree, she introduced me at a church supper as, "This is my daughter, she went to college for old papers." 4 years of my life, dissolved into a punchline between the casseroles and the pie. Through my 20s, I did the unglamorous version of my dream, because the glamorous version did not exist yet. I worked processing collections at a historical society in Savannah for $28,000 a year. I did lineage verification on contract for 2 heritage societies, and I spent my vacations in courthouse basements. And every one of those years, the still point in my world was Geneva's kitchen table. She was in her 80s by then and slowing, but her mind stayed sharp as a filleting knife. And we had a standing date, first Sunday of the month, the Bible and the boxes and the attic fan. It was at that table, in the last year of her life, that she did the thing that saved everything, though neither of us said so out loud. I was 29. She had been to the heart doctor that week, and she didn't tell me what he said, but she had a look I had never seen on her, the look of someone packing for a trip. She had the Bible open to the births register, to the water-stained second leaf, the page I had memorized at 9. And while I watched, she took a flat razor blade and a steel ruler, and with 2 long, patient strokes, she cut that page out of the book, the one her family had kept for 120 years. I actually said, "Grandma, stop," like she was hurting something alive. She did not stop. She slid the page into a stiff plastic sleeve she had bought for the purpose, taped a folded note to the back of the sleeve, and put it in my hands. And she said, "This one page is the spine of the whole family, and I want it living at your house now, not mine. Keep it somewhere safe. You'll know when it matters." I asked her what she meant. She looked at me over the red beaded chain of her glasses and answered me straight. "Your mother thinks paper is clutter, and Dorothea is going to outlive me out there on that bluff with no will and no children. And you are the only one of us who knows what those 2 facts add up to." Then she patted my hand twice, the way she did when a lesson was over, and asked if I wanted pound cake. The note taped to the back of the sleeve was 11 words, in her hand, shakier than the hand that had taught me to trace letters, but hers. "Keep this where it won't get lost. You'll know when. Geneva." I took it home to my apartment in Savannah and put it in a fireproof document box on the top shelf of my closet, between my passport and my diploma. You will hear about that box again. Geneva died that November, 4 days after her 86th birthday, in her own bed in the white frame house, which is the only mercy in this part of the story. I was 29. The funeral was at Perrin's Landing Baptist, and it was standing room only because a woman like that leaves a dent in a county. I got through it. What I did not get through, what I am not fully through even now, was what happened 9 days later. 9 days after we buried her, on a Saturday, I drove out to Geneva's house to begin what I assumed would be a long, careful family project of going through her things. I had boxes of acid-free folders in my trunk. I had a plan for cataloging. I turned onto her road and I saw the dumpster in the yard. A rented roll-off dumpster, the 20-yard kind, sitting on the grass. Geneva had mowed herself until she was 83, and it was full. My mother and 2 men from the church were carrying out the last of it. She had gotten the keys from the estate lawyer on Thursday and worked straight through, Friday and Saturday, without calling me once. The furniture, she thought, was worth anything had gone to a consignment shop in Statesboro. 11 trash bags of clothes had gone to the donation bin behind the Baptist church. And the shoe boxes and hat boxes and the old ammunition crate, the letters, the photographs going back to the 1890s, the land papers, the funeral programs, the Bible itself with its cracked black leather. All of it had gone into that dumpster or out to the county transfer station in the Friday load. I stood in the yard and I could not make my mouth work. My mother came down the porch steps pulling off her gloves and said, and I am quoting her exactly, "Well, don't look at me like that. No one needs that old stuff. It was just clutter she never got around to throwing out herself." I said, "Mama, the Bible, the letters. That was 130 years of this family." And she said, "It was a fire hazard is what it was, and dust, and I am not going to have my mother remembered as a hoarder." Then she looked past me at the two men and told them where to set a nightstand. I climbed into that dumpster. I want you to have this picture of me, 29 years old, in funeral week clothes, standing thigh-deep in my grandmother's life. My mother watched from the porch with her arms crossed, embarrassed by me one last time on Geneva's own land. I found a cast-iron skillet, a coffee can of buttons, and one photograph, water-ruined, of a man standing by a truck. The Friday load was already gone, and the transfer station does not let you pick. Somewhere under 60 feet of county garbage was the Bible, with the razor-cut stub where one page used to be. My mother never even noticed a page was missing, because she never once in her life opened that book. She did not know I had it. Standing in that dumpster, I did not tell her. Some cold, patient part of me, the part Geneva trained, closed its hand around that secret and kept it. 5 weeks after the funeral, the church put on a memorial gathering for Geneva, the kind small towns do when the casseroles run out but the grief hasn't. It was a Sunday afternoon in the fellowship hall, with folding tables and a slideshow and 140 people who had loved her. I asked the pastor's wife if I could set up one small table. She said, "Of course, honey," and gave me the one by the coat rack. I kept it modest on purpose. A tablecloth from home. The 7 photographs I had managed to save over the years because they had lived at my apartment, not Geneva's house. A 1-page timeline I wrote out by hand, Ezekiel buying the bluff in 1913 for $240, the storms, the marriages, Geneva's whole line, ending with her birthday and the date we buried her. And a little card that said, "If you remember something about Geneva or the Fenwicks, write it down for me." I put out index cards and 3 pens. That was the whole exhibit. It took up 4 feet of table by a coat rack. For about 20 minutes, it worked the way I dreamed it would. 2 of Geneva's church friends stood there with their glasses pushed up, telling me about shrimp boats. An old man wrote half an index card about Geneva's father and had to stop and hold his chin. For the first time in my life, my work did the exact thing I always believed it could do. It could hand people back their dead for a minute. Then my mother came across the fellowship hall. I saw her clock the table from 30 feet, saw her face do the arithmetic of who was watching, and she did not slow down when she reached it. She gathered up my 7 photographs in a stack, tapped them even like a deck of cards, and set them face down. She picked up the timeline, folded it in half, and spoke in a voice that was not a whisper, in front of the church friends and the old man and whoever else stood in earshot. "The family history nonsense," she said, died with your grandmother, Bethany. This is not the time, and honestly, there is never going to be a time. People are here to grieve, not to watch you play with dead people." Then she took the index cards, the ones with strangers' memories of Geneva already written on them, squared the stack, and dropped it in her purse like confiscating a phone from a teenager. And she walked away to greet the Hendersons. The old man looked at me. The church friends looked at the punch bowl. I stood next to my emptied table, 41 days after burying the only person who ever took me seriously, and I felt something in my chest do the opposite of breaking. It set, like concrete. I folded my tablecloth, put my 7 photographs back in their envelope, thanked the pastor's wife, and drove the 40 minutes back to Savannah with the radio off. I want to be honest about what I did next, because people imagine going no contact is a door slammed in one hot moment, and mine wasn't. I tried for almost a year. I called her that week, and she said I was being dramatic and the memorial had gone lovely. I wrote her a letter, 4 pages, the bravest thing I ever put on paper to that point, telling her about the dumpster and the table and asking her, plainly, to see me. She never mentioned receiving it, but she mentioned to Garrett that I had sent her, quote, an essay. I went to one last Thanksgiving, where she told the table the cashier joke again, 11 years after graduation, and Garrett laughed without thinking, the way you laugh at a rerun laugh track. On the drive home from that Thanksgiving, I did the math Geneva taught me to do, the math of records. 30 years of evidence, all of it saying the same thing. A record made at the time by somebody with no reason to lie. My mother had told me who I was to her, at 12 through a cracked door, at 18 over sweet tea, at 29 across a dumpster, at 30 over an emptied table. The record was consistent. It was I who kept refusing to certify it. So in the first week of December, when I was 30 years old, I stopped. No announcement, no final scene, no letter. I changed nothing dramatic. I simply did not call again, and I let her discover, one unreturned message at a time, that the daughter in the hallway had walked out of the hallway. She left 4 voicemails in the first 6 months, each one angrier at the inconvenience than curious about the cause, and then she stopped too, and told the family her version. I would learn that version much later, word for word, from my sister-in-law. The version was, Bethany couldn't handle the family and walked away without a word. My mother threw out 130 years of records and then wrote a false one about me. Remember that. It matters at the cabin. 11 years. That is the size of the silence, so let me build those 11 years for you honestly, because this is not a story about a woman who sat in the dark, waiting to be avenged. I built a life, and the life is the point. Year 1 was grief and rent. I will not decorate it. In year 2, I used Geneva's small bequest to me, $8,000 exactly, to enroll in a graduate certificate program in genealogical research. 15 months, nights and weekends, while I kept my day job. Forensic genealogy was just becoming a real discipline then, genealogy that can survive a courtroom, every finding sourced to primary records, every conclusion written so a judge can follow it. The first time a professor described an airship case, a family about to lose land because they couldn't prove who the heirs were, I sat in my parked car afterward for 20 minutes. I could hear Geneva at the table. Dorothea is going to outlive me out on that bluff with no will, and you are the only one who knows what those two facts add up to. In year 3, I met Julian Barlow at a Georgia Historical Society lecture on Reconstruction-era land records, which I promise is the most on-brand sentence in this entire story. He was there because he teaches 11th grade history and wanted material. He asked one smart question from the back row, and afterward, at the coffee urn, I told him his question had a flaw in it. He grinned like I had handed him a present, and that was more or less that. Julian is calm the way deep water is calm. In 12 years, he has never once found my work morbid. He finds it holy, his word, and when we married, 2 years later at the courthouse in Savannah with 9 guests, taking his name was not an erasure. It felt like witness protection I got to choose, though I could not have told you yet from what. Years 4 through 8, I did the apprentice grind. I joined Ostrander and Pell, a forensic genealogy firm with its main office in Jacksonville and a 2-desk satellite in Savannah. I worked probate cases across Georgia and the Carolinas, kinship determinations, missing heir searches, and more of the saddest specialty in the South, heirs property work. 1,500 billable hours a year of courthouse deed rooms, funeral home ledgers, and church minute books. In year 8, I passed the certification exam and became board certified, and the framed certificate went on my office wall under my married name, Bethany Barlow. My mother's maiden name daughter had quietly ceased to exist on paper. I did not plan that as a disguise. Life just built me one. And through all 11 of those years, the fireproof box came with me, apartment to the little brick house Julian and I bought on the south side of Savannah. Every time we moved, the movers took the furniture, and the box rode in the front seat of my car with my hands. Twice a year, roughly Easter and Geneva's birthday, I would take the sleeve out and sit with it at my own kitchen table. The water stain like a thumbprint. The 1929 marriage in slanted iron gall brown. Ollie, our lamb, 2 years old, and taped to the back 11 words. Keep this where it won't get lost. You'll know when. Geneva. I want to pause on something, because I think somebody listening needs it said plainly. Those 11 years were not cold storage. They were the warmest years of my life to that point. Nobody at my table placed me in a hallway. And here is what surprised me, the thing nobody tells you about stepping away from people who diminish you. I did not miss my mother so much as I missed the argument, the lifelong, unwinnable case I had been building for the defense. When the case went quiet, there was room in me for other things. There was room, it turned out, for exactly the skills that were about to be needed. Because in March of last year, out on the bluff over Cutter's Creek, in the cabin her grandfather built in 1926, my great-aunt Dorothea Fenwick died in her sleep at 91 years old. She never married. She had no children, and she left no will. I did not go to the funeral. I found out about it 11 days after the fact, from a Fenwick cousin's Facebook post. I sat in my office and cried for a woman I had not been allowed near in a decade, and for the last door to Geneva's generation closing. Then I did something that shames me a little, and that I would do again. I pulled up the Chatham County property records and looked at the bluff. And what I saw made my stomach drop through the floor, because I look at parcels like Dorothea's for a living, and I know exactly what happens to them. Let me teach you the 30-second version of what I do, because the whole climax of this story runs on it. When land passes down for generations without wills, without probate, without deeds, the law says every legal heir owns a sliver of it, together, automatically. Sounds warm. It is a trap. It is called heirs' property, and it is how black and white families alike across the coastal South have lost millions of acres. Because when nobody can produce a clean, documented list of every living heir, the title is clouded. You cannot mortgage it, you cannot insure it properly. And worst of all, a developer can buy out any single heir's sliver, even a 2% sliver from a cousin in another state who has never seen the land. The moment that happens, the developer becomes a co-owner. And a co-owner can walk into court and force what is called a partition sale. The whole property goes to auction, usually for a fraction of its worth, and the family's 100 years on that land ends at a courthouse podium in 20 minutes. The Fenwick Bluff was a textbook case. Ezekiel bought it in 1913 and died in 1954 without a will. Nobody probated it, because families like ours settled things at kitchen tables. His heirs just kept living there and paying the taxes, which is what honest people do, and exactly what the law does not credit. By the time Dorothea died, the paper trail said the land belonged, in undivided slivers, to every living descendant of Ezekiel Fenwick's 3 children. 3 children. One of whom, remember, was a baby named Ollie, our lamb, dead at 2 in 1921, in an era when the county's copy of half its own records was about to burn. Encircling that cloud of a title was a company called Tidemark Shore Partners, a regional outfit out of Bluffton. It had spent 5 years quietly buying up exactly this kind of parcel between Savannah and Brunswick. 18 acres of high ground with live oaks, 600 feet of marsh frontage on Cutter's Creek, 25 minutes from downtown Savannah. The county had it assessed around $900,000, and a broker friend told me, informally, that cleared and subdivided it would carry a project value north of $2 million. Within 4 months of Dorothea's death, Tidemark had done 2 things. They located a great-grandson of Ezekiel's oldest boy, a man in Ohio who had never stood on that bluff, and bought his undocumented sliver of an interest for $40,000. And then they filed a partition action on the whole 18 acres. I knew all of this from public filings before my family knew I knew anything at all. Monitoring partition filings in 6 coastal counties is, quite literally, a Monday morning task on my calendar. What I did not know was what my family was doing about it. I found that out on a Tuesday in September, when my managing partner, Margaret Chu, stopped at my desk with an intake sheet and said the sentence that split my life in half. She said, "New heirship matter out of Chatham County, referral from a probate attorney named Preston Yates, estate of Dorothea Fenwick. Any conflict." Any conflict. I looked at the intake sheet, and there, in the client contact line, in 12-point type, was my mother's name and the phone number I still knew by heart. Roberta Thornton. She had called my firm that morning. Cold. Out of the phone book of the living, so to speak, because Preston Yates had told the family, in plain terms, what I could have told them 11 years earlier. A tangled title is a genealogy problem before it is a legal problem, And the only thing that stops a partition sale is a certified, court-admissible chain of airship, fast. He gave them 3 names of firms in the Southeast who do this work at the level a contested case needs. Ours was first, he said, by reputation. My mother, who told her cousin Faye that genealogy is what you do when you can't handle real life, dialed the number herself and asked how much it would cost, and gasped at the retainer and paid it. $12,500. From the woman who would not frame my certificate. She spoke to our intake coordinator for 40 minutes and never asked the name of the genealogist who would be assigned, because why would she? You do not ask the name of the plumber. You ask when the water comes back on. So there it is, the moment this entire channel exists for. Standing at my desk, holding a piece of paper, realizing that my mother had just hired the daughter she erased, at full market rate, to do the exact thing she spent 30 years mocking. Hired her to save the land her own dumpster nearly doomed. And she had no idea. Now, before you ask, here is what I did and did not do in the next hour. I did not hang a photo of her on a dartboard, and I did not laugh, though Julian will testify I sat in the car that evening for a while. What I did was walk into Margaret's office and disclose everything, because my certification and my name, the one I built, live and die on ethics. I told her the client was my estranged mother, and that I was myself, technically, a member of the air class as Geneva's granddaughter, which in airship work is a real conflict you handle in daylight. We did it by the book. My interest was disclosed in writing in the engagement file. Every finding I produced would be independently verified and co-signed by a second board-certified genealogist, my colleague. And the final report would state my relationship to the family on page 2, in plain sight, for the court and every party to read. Margaret asked me once, quietly, "Do you want this case, or should it go to Jacksonville?" And I looked out the window for a moment, and I heard an old woman's voice at a kitchen table. "You'll know when it matters." I said, "It's mine." She nodded, and that was the whole ceremony. Quick pause, because we are about to walk down to the bluff for the part you came for, and I need to know something. Has anybody else in the family carried a secret like that box in my closet? Something you kept safe for years while the people who threw it away never even noticed it was gone? Tell me in the comments, because I have read 10,000 family stories in courthouse basements, and I promise yours belongs in the record too. All right. Deep breath. Back to it. For the next 7 weeks, I did the quietest, most patient work of my career, and I want you to see that it was work, not theater. A chain of airship for a case like this is a 200-page proof. I pulled 41 deed book entries in 3 counties, going back to the 1913 purchase, $240, Ezekiel's signature and X witnessed by 2 men. I pulled census sheets from 1920 through 1950, draft cards, 4 estate files, cemetery plats, and the sexton's burial ledger from the little cemetery behind Sandhill Chapel. I wrote to the state archives for the death certificate index. I hired a runner to photograph probate minutes in a courthouse annex with no scanner and 1 working light. And I called the living. That was the strangest part, cold calling my own blood under my married name. A second cousin named Lavinia Coombs in Brunswick, in her 70s, who talked to me for 2 hours about the Fenwicks and never knew she was talking to one. A cousin named Holly's in Jacksonville who had the 1926 photographs of the cabin being built and mailed me scans. Affidavit by affidavit, record by record, the tree took shape, 180 pages, 62 exhibits, every living heir of Ezekiel Fenwick identified, documented, and locatable. 19 people, as it turned out, my mother and Garrett and me among them, which the report stated plainly. But there were 2 holes, and I had known there would be, because Geneva had told me, at her kitchen table, exactly where the family's paper was thin. Tidemark's lawyers knew about the holes too, and their whole case for the partition sale leaned on them. Hole number 1, the 1929 marriage of Geneva and Dorothea's parents, the license burned in the 1936 Annex fire. Without proof of that marriage, the legitimacy of the whole descending line could be mudded, in exactly the way that makes a judge give up and order an auction. Hole number 2, baby Ollie. The 1920 census showed a 3rd child in Ezekiel's household, and no county record showed what became of him. Tidemark's attorneys argued that this child might have lived, moved away, and left descendants, unknown heirs, unfindable heirs, and that with the heir class impossible to close, partition, and sale was the only workable remedy. It is a cynical argument, and it works all the time. Unless somebody can close the holes. Unless somewhere there exists a contemporaneous family record, made by a person with no motive to lie, naming the marriage and the baby's death. Courts in Georgia have accepted family Bible pages as evidence of birth, marriage, and death for 200 years. It is settled law. It is, in fact, Exhibit 14. I drove home the night I finished the report, took the fireproof box down from the closet shelf, and set the sleeve on my kitchen table next to a numbered exhibit tag. The water stained like a thumbprint. The long-tailed bee and lamb. 11 words in a shaky hand on the back. You'll know when. I knew now. I photographed it under archival light, wrote the authentication affidavit, my own name and my grandmother's chain of custody, and sealed the original for court. Then I sat there for a long time with my hand flat on the sleeve, the way you'd rest a hand on a sleeping child, and Julian came in and sat with me, and neither of us said one word. The meeting was set for a Thursday morning in late October, 19 days before the partition hearing, and Preston Yates chose the venue, which I will thank him for privately until the day I die. Not a conference room. The land itself. His reasoning was practical. He wanted the Tidemark representative to walk the parcel and understand what the family's settlement position was, and he wanted the heirs present to review the genealogical report in person before it was filed. So on the 23rd of October, at 9 in the morning, 7 people gathered on the bluff over Cutter's Creek, under live oaks older than the county, at a folding table Yates paralegal set up on the cabin's front porch. The tide was out. If you have never smelled a Georgia marsh at low tide, it is mud and salt and iodine and thyme, and it is the smell of every summer Sunday of my childhood. I stood in it, holding a document box, and watched my mother get out of Garrett's truck. 11 years. Her hair had gone fully white, and she had gotten smaller, the way our people do, and she was wearing her funeral-land lawyer's dress, navy with a white collar. Garrett had a gray in his beard and his father's way of standing with his thumbs in his pockets. Beside him was a woman I had never met, dark-haired, watchful in her late 30s, and I knew from the file that this was his wife, Marisol, married 6 years ago, at a wedding I did not know was happening. The Tidemark man, Grant Sutcliffe, land acquisitions, wore the kind of quilted vest that costs more than a mortgage payment and kept checking the signal on his phone. Understand the geometry of that porch. They had been told the genealogist was coming. They had been told her report could stop the sale. My mother walked past me at a distance of 10 feet, nodded the brisk nod you give hired help, and took her seat. I was a 41-year-old woman in a gray suit with her hair pinned up and glasses on and a married name in her briefcase, standing in a place my mother's mind had no slot for me. People do not see what they are not looking for. I know that professionally. Census takers miss whole families that way. Still, some animal part of me lifted its head when her eyes went over mine and caught on nothing. Yates opened it. 62, courtly, half glasses, a voice like a porch swing. He said, "Folks, thank you for coming out. I know this place matters, which is exactly why we're standing on it." Then he said, "Most of you haven't met Ms. Barlow of Ostrander and Pell. Her firm prepared the airship report, and I'll tell you plainly, it is the finest piece of work of its kind I have seen in 30 years of probate practice. It is the reason we are in a position to talk settlement instead of surrender." And my mother, without raising her hand, spoke. To Yates, past me, the way you talk about staff in front of staff. She said, "Well, I hope it's worth what we paid for it, because I'll be honest with you, Preston, I don't understand a word of this. $12,500 to be told who our own kin are." She gave a little laugh and looked around the table to collect the room, the exact way she collected it at graduation dinners and church suppers. And then she said, "I raised a child who wanted to do this for a living, so believe me, I know all about it. I said it 30 years ago and I will say it today. Genealogy isn't a career, it's what you do when you can't handle real life. She'll grow out of it, or she won't amount to anything." The marsh was the only thing that made a sound. A clapper rail somewhere down in the Spartina, that dry rattle. I had waited 29 years to find out whether she remembered saying it, whether the sentence that rebuilt my whole childhood had even registered as an event in hers. And there was my answer. She remembered it fine. She was proud of it. It was material. I did not plan what I did next, whatever you may choose to believe. I took my glasses off because they were suddenly in my way, and I looked at her, and in the voice she used to hear across a kitchen table I said, "She heard you say that, Mama, through the bedroom door." She was 12. I have watched recognition happen my whole career, in archives, on doorsteps, in the eyes of heirs learning their own name's history, and I have never seen anything like my mother's face on that porch. It went in stages, like water finding a level. The polite blank for the stranger, the frown at the accent, at the word mama. Then her eyes did the thing eyes do when the mind finally roots the face to the right file. They widened and then flinched, as if the sun had come off the water wrong and her hand went out flat on the folding table. The table rocked, and Garrett's coffee went over, and nobody moved to catch it. Her breath was audible. 3 of them through her mouth. She said, in a voice I had never heard her use, small, ambushed Bethany. And Garrett stood up so fast his chair went off the porch edge into the sand, and said my name too, but his voice broke in the middle of it. That was different, and I will come back to that. Sutcliffe looked up from his phone for the first time all morning. Marisol had gone very still, and her eyes were moving between my mother's face and mine, and I could see her doing math, fast, the kind of math that rearranges a decade. Yates, who is a better poker player than any of us knew, said gently, I take it introductions are in order after all. He had known, of course. Page 2 of the report disclosed it, in the flattest language of my profession. The preparing genealogist is a lineal descendant of Geneva Fenwick Winslow and a member of the identified heir class. All findings herein have been independently verified and co-signed by a second certified genealogist. He had read it. My family had not, because my family does not read what I write. That is not a wound talking, that is the factual record of this story. I sat down across from my mother, opened the box, and did my job. That is the part I need you to understand about the next 40 minutes. I did not perform. I presented. Deed by deed, census sheet by census sheet, I walk them through their own blood, Ezekiel and his ex and his $240, the 3 children, the 19 living heirs. I watched Garrett actually lean in, over the 1926 photographs of the cabin, being framed by men with his own jawline. And then I reached the holes, the 1929 marriage and the baby. I explained, in the flat voice I use for court, that Tidemark's entire partition argument lived in those 2 gaps. The family's case would have died in those gaps, and the auction would have happened in the spring. Except, I lifted Exhibit 14 from the box, in its cradle of acid-free board, and I set it in the middle of the folding table, on the porch of the cabin that Page had been written to protect. 60 years of Fenwick births in brown iron gall and blue ballpoint. The marriage of October 1929 in a slanted hand. Ollie, born June 1919, died August 1921, our lamb. The water stain along the bottom edge, shaped like a thumbprint from a roof leak that happened not 400 yards from where we were sitting. Marisol asked the question, not my mother. Marisol leaned over the sleeve, read it top to bottom, and said, where does a page like this even come from? And I said, it is the second leaf of the births register from the Fenwick Family Bible, printed 1874. My grandmother, Geneva, cut it out with a razor blade at her kitchen table in the last year of her life, and gave it to me with a note, and the note is in evidence too. And I recited it because I have had it memorized for 11 years. Keep this where it won't get lost. You'll know when. Geneva. My mother said that Bible is gone. It came out of her before she could stop it, and it told the whole porch everything, because there is only one way she could know it was gone. I said, quietly and with no heat in it, yes, ma'am, the rest of it is in the county landfill, where you sent it 9 days after her funeral in the Friday load. This page survived because Geneva did not trust you with it, and it turns out she was right, and it is now the single document standing between this family and losing this bluff. I did not say it cruelly. Cruelty would have been easier for her, honestly, because cruelty can be dismissed. I said it the way I say things to judges. Nobody spoke. Sutcliffe, God help him, chose that silence to clear his throat and say something about Tidemark remaining open to a fair number. And Yates said, "Mr. Sutcliffe, we'll get to you," in a voice you could have iced fish on. And then Marisol broke, not loudly. She was looking at my mother, and she said, "You told me she walked away." Her voice had a tremor in it, but it did not stop. 6 years, Roberta. You told me she couldn't handle being part of this family, that she left without a word, and I set a place at my table every Christmas, thinking my husband's sister was somebody who throws families away. She looked at me, and her chin was going, and she said, "You didn't walk away, did you? You were carried out with the trash." Nobody answered her, because the question answered itself, and Garrett put his hand over his eyes like a man at a graveside. That white-knuckled minute, right there, cost my mother more than the $12,500 ever did. My mother looked at the page for a long time, longer than she had ever looked at anything of mine. And here is the part I promised myself I would tell honestly, even though it complicates the story people want. Her face came apart for a second. Just 1 second, but I was 10 feet away and I know what I saw. Her mouth worked, and her hand came up off the table, like she was going to reach for the sleeve or for me. And she said, barely above the railbirds, "I thought if the old things were gone you would finally." And she stopped. Right there, at the edge of the only sentence that ever mattered. I watched her stand at that edge, afraid, and I understood, in one cold, clean drop, that she had thrown Geneva's boxes away on purpose in the fullest sense. The clutter story was, and always had been, a lid on something. And whatever was under the lid was about needing me smaller than my grandmother made me feel. And then she straightened her collar with both hands, and the second closed. She said, "Well, I suppose it's a good thing somebody kept it." And she looked at Yates and asked, in her farm bureau front office voice, whether this meant the auction was off. That was it. That was the whole apology I got on that porch, and I want every listener to hear me clearly. It was enough to proceed on. It was not enough to build on. Both things are true, and learning to hold both is the actual end of this story. Here is how it ended in the world of paper, which is the world I trust. The report was filed with the court 8 days after the porch, 180 pages, 62 exhibits, co-signed, my relationship to the family disclosed on page 2 for the judge and everyone else to read. Exhibit 14 was authenticated under the family records exception, the way Bible pages have been in Georgia courtrooms for 2 centuries, and it closed both holes. The 1929 marriage was proven. Ollie's line was closed, our lamb, doing his last work for this family 104 years after he died. The heir class was complete and documented, 19 names, no phantoms for Tidemark to conjure. And under Georgia's Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, which exists precisely because of stories like ours, a documented family gets rights a clouded one does not. Appraisal, the chance to buy out a hostile co-owner at fair value, preference for keeping land whole. 12 days before the hearing, Tidemark's lawyers called Yates. The family bought back the Ohio cousin's $40,000 sliver for $52,000, financed across 11 of the 19 heirs, and Tidemark dismissed the partition action and went off to find a family with worse records. The auction never happened. The bluff stayed Fenwick. Yates told me later that without Exhibit 14, he would have advised the family to negotiate a sale price. The difference between those two futures, measured against what Tidemark paid for comparable clouded parcels, was somewhere around $1.5 million and 112 years of a family knowing where it belongs. Then he said, off the record, that in 30 years of probate work, he had never seen an inheritance quite like mine. He did not mean money. He meant a razor blade, a steel ruler, and an old woman who saw the whole board. Now, the part of the ending you actually came here to hear about, which is what happened between me and them, and I will give it to you plainly, because tidy would be a lie. In November, 3 weeks after the porch, the family agreed, at Yates' conference table and with almost no argument, that the bluff needed one voice going forward so this could never happen again. The heirs signed the property into a family land entity, and they made me its manager. 19 owners, 1 steward. My mother raised no objection. She sat at the far end of the table while the papers went around, and when the pen came to her, she signed without a speech, which from Roberta Thornton is a kind of speech. The cabin where Dorothea lived and died, the 18 acres, the 600 feet of marsh, the live oaks, all of it now moves through my signature. The daughter who went to college for old papers is the one, now, who decides what happens to the land those old papers saved. I put a new tin roof on the cabin in the spring for $14,000, out of the entity's account, funded by all of us, and I keep the tax bill paid 4 months early. One day, if the family wants, there will be a proper archive room where the leaky corner used to be. No leak is ever again getting near a Fenwick record while I am alive. Garrett came to see me in Savannah the week after the signing, alone, no phone call first. He stood on my porch turning his cap in his hands like a man standing at a door, unsure he still had the right to knock. He said, I laughed at the cashier joke. I laughed at all of it, B, for 30 years, and I never once asked you a single question about your work, and you saved the bluff. He did not cry, Garrett doesn't, but his voice kept dropping out. I let him in and we ate at my kitchen table, and it was awkward and real. Now it is a standing thing, him and Marisol, first Sunday of the month, which is a date I chose on purpose and have never explained to them. Marisol and I text most weeks. She has started scanning the documents Holly's mailed, carefully, by the edges, the way I taught her. She apologized to me exactly once for believing the story she was handed, and I told her the truth, which is that she was its victim too, just a smaller dose. The record she was given was false, and she updated it the moment she saw primary evidence. Honestly, that is all I have ever asked of anyone. My mother is a different ledger. She called me 8 days after the porch. I let it go to voicemail on purpose, not to punish her, but because I wanted to hear what she would say to a machine where there was no room to manage. What she said was, Bethany, it's your mother. I suppose you know that. The lawyer says we'll keep the land. Your grandmother would be. And there was a pause that lasted 4 seconds. I have counted it many times, and then she said, call me when you can. That pause is the closest my mother has ever come, then or since, to the sentence she could not finish on the porch. I have kept the voicemail. Of course I have. I am who I am. I called her back 3 days later, and I set the terms, calmly, the way I present findings. 1 phone call a month on the first Saturday, and I make it, not her. Holidays at Garrett and Marisol's table, neutral ground, and I stay as long as it stays kind. She may see the bluff when I am there, and she has come twice. The second time, she stood under the biggest oak for a while by herself, looking at the water, and whatever happened inside her out there is hers to keep. What there is not, and may never be, is the kitchen table thing, the easy daily thread. She has never said the word sorry. I have stopped listing that as a missing record and started listing it as a fact about the source. Some documents are simply not going to exist, and a good genealogist grieves the gap and works with what was actually written. People ask me, the few who know the whole story, whether I feel like I won. I will tell you what I feel. On the first Saturday of every month, I make a phone call that costs me something, and on the first Sunday, my brother sits at my table. In between, some evenings, I drive out to the bluff alone, and I sit on the cabin steps Ezekiel's sons built in 1926. The tide comes in over the mud, and the smell is the smell of Geneva's porch. The original of Exhibit 14 came back from the court file when the case closed. It lives in a proper archival housing now in the fireproof box, but I will tell you a secret. Twice a year, roughly Easter and her birthday, I still take it out at my kitchen table. The brown ink and the blue. The marriage of 1929. Ollie, our lamb. The water stain shaped like a thumbprint, and I put my own thumb near it, not on it, never on it, and 11 words in a shaky hand. Keep this where it won't get lost. You'll know when. Geneva. She knew when. She knew everything, my grandmother, at a kitchen table with a razor blade, years before any of us. The page outlived her, and it outlived the dumpster, and it will outlive me, because that is what records are for. Paper is how the dead keep their promises. Before I leave you with what this whole thing taught me, if this story held you the way it still holds me, do one thing for me down in the comments. Tell me who the Geneva is in your life, the one person who took the thing everyone else mocked and treated it like it mattered. And if you still have them, maybe tell them this week, not someday. And if you want more true stories about the quiet ones who kept the receipts, the ones families underestimate right up until the day they are needed, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is always another one coming, and the next one starts in a hospital parking garage. Looking back across all of it, the hallway and the dumpster and the porch, here is what I know now that I could not have told you at 12. The thing your family calls useless is very often the thing that ends up saving them. For 30 years, my work was the punchline, the morbid hobby, the degree in old papers, and then one Tuesday it was the only rope across the canyon. The same woman who would not frame my certificate paid $12,500, at market rate, for an hour of what it built. Nobody handed me that reversal. The work itself did it, quietly, one courthouse basement at a time, while the jokes went on. So if the people at your table laugh at the thing your hands keep reaching for, keep reaching. Usefulness reveals itself on its own schedule, and it does not check first with the people who laughed. One person who takes you seriously outweighs a house full of people who do not. I grew up in a hallway, and I should by every rule have believed what the hallway taught. But 9 miles away there was a kitchen table, an attic fan, and a woman who made me wash my hands before touching the book. Geneva did not argue with my mother about my worth. She just kept setting a place for it, first Sunday of the month, for 20 years, And that one steady place turned out to be load-bearing for my entire life. You do not need the whole family to see you. You need one true witness, and if you have one, that is not a consolation prize, that is the foundation. And if you are somebody's one witness right now, for a grandchild or a niece or a student, understand that you may be doing the biggest thing you will ever do. Erasing someone from the story does not remove them from the record. My mother worked her whole life at the version of things, the introductions, the jokes, the tale she fed Marisol about the daughter who walked away without a word. And every bit of it collapsed in one morning on a porch, because versions are soft and records are hard. The records, the letter she never answered, the dumpster she rented, the page she never knew existed, all kept telling the truth without me saying a word. If someone is writing you out of the family story right now, hear this. You do not have to outshout a false version. Live carefully, keep your own record honestly, and let time do what time does to paper and to lies, which is opposite things. You can save people and still not hand them the key back. This is the one that took me longest, so I saved it for last. When the land was safe, everyone expected the water to close over the past, and 11 years of silence to be filed under misunderstanding. I did not do that. I make one call a month, on my day, from my kitchen, and my mother and I have exactly as much relationship as is safe to have. The bluff that nearly drowned in her clutter story now moves through my signature. Rescue and reunion are two different transactions, and you are allowed to complete the first without being billed for the second. If you are living some version of this right now, if you are the one they underestimated and the phone is starting to ring because suddenly you are needed, you can answer the call and still keep your own address. Help with both hands if you choose to. But the pace, the terms, the door, those stay yours. Mine did. And out on those cabin steps at high tide, I am more at peace than I have ever been in my life.